good afternoon and welcome to this briefing on the findings of Climate Assembly UK. I'm delighted you could join us this afternoon. My name is Chris Shaw. I'm the Parliamentary Director of the Assembly, which means that I'm working on behalf of the 6 select committees that commissioned the Assembly. I'm delighted to say we've got with us for this briefing today Sarah Allen from Involve, the public participation charity that ran the Assembly for us. And we've got 2 of the expert leads who helped design and deliver the Assembly as well. That's Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh and Professor Becky Willis. So very pleased to have them with us to brief you on the findings of the Assembly and also to answer your questions. So in case you don't have any idea of what a Citizens Assembly looks like, don't worry, you're in the right place. We've got a short video to play you just as an introduction to give you a flavour of what it was like. So I'm going to invite Jack to run the video now and then hand over to Sarah to start presenting the slides. Jack.
Dear resident.
Dear resident.
Dear resident.
You could be one of over 100
people selected to take part in the UK-wide Citizens Assembly
on how
should the UK tackle climate change. It's an interesting proposition.
I'm Amanda from Kent and I'm 27.
So this weekend is going to be about introducing you to climate change in a thorough way.
It was really exciting. To be told I was selected just seemed like a very rare opportunity.
Initially, I wasn't sure what it would be like, because I hadn't done anything like that before.
Perfectly honest with you, I didn't have a clue what zero carbon was.
I didn't know enough about climate change. I was open to information.
There were so many different perspectives and opinions. So many people of different ethnicity, different ages.
It was so nice to see, the representation of the UK.
The fact that you've given up time to come here and take this seriously is of the greatest importance.
It felt like the community kind of working together towards a problem that the whole world needs to face, to be fair.
Obviously at the moment we're all on lockdown.
Moving on to 3 internet weekends was quite good. We were still investigating things on our own. I'm not saying we're experts now, but we all have opinions.
Everybody's had the taste of this cleaner air. Surely most people would want that for their children and their grandchildren.
Well, if we treat climate change the same way as we're treating coronavirus, then we can do it.
We all want the government to take heed of our recommendations.
They need to act on it, but also to act on it fast. So it's not about saying, okay, we just keep deliberating over it over the next 1 year, 2 years.
They are by law bound to try to get to this target.
It's got to be done in a fair and positive way.
So if we don't act now, we're just going to run out of time and there won't be a future for any of us.
And if we can show that we can do it, then perhaps others will follow. I think somebody has to be a leader.
Thank you. Well, I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour of what the Assembly was like. We played that video at the launch last Thursday. The launch was hosted in Parliament and had MPs, Secretary of State and many people joining us. So we're very excited to have launched it last week, and we look forward to sharing the conclusions with you now. Our speakers are going to talk for around about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind perhaps just listening to them a bit before you start using the Q&A function to post any questions, please, and then I will read them out and secure answers for you. Okay, without any further ado, I want to hand you over to Sarah Allen to just outline, first of all, something about the process of the Assembly. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Chris. So hopefully
you can all see the slides now. Becky, can you see them? Could you nod if you can see them? Excellent. So, as Chris alluded to, one of the reasons that we're so excited to be here and presenting the results of Climate Assembly UK to you is that this is the UK first. It's the first ever UK-wide Citizens' Assembly on climate change. It was commissioned by 6 select committees of the House of Commons in the last Parliament to look at a specific question. So how the UK should reach its legally binding target of net zero emissions by 2050. And the committees were really clear when they did that the reason that they felt it was so important to hear public preferences on this question was because of the impact that decisions about how to get to net zero will have on people's lives. The report that we launched last week contains a unique and an invaluable body of evidence about public preferences for how to get to net zero. And it's really able to do that because of the unique nature of the Citizens' Assembly process. So to talk about that just a little bit. So first of all, the Assembly members came from all walks of life and all across the UK. In terms of pure numbers, they were representative of the wider population, firstly in terms of demographics, so age, gender, ethnicity, educational level, also geography, whether they lived in an urban or a rural area and whereabouts in the UK they lived, and importantly also their level of concern about climate change, including if they were concerned at all. So that's the numbers bit, but to give you a bit more of a feel for what it's like to be at the Assembly along with the video, when we first met the Assembly members, the youngest was 16 and the oldest was 79, and between them the Assembly members included people who work for the NHS, who were cleaners, engineers, currently unemployed, business owners, full-time carers and so many other roles. The Assembly members met for 6 weekends in total, 3 offline in Birmingham and then because of COVID-19, 3 online. And at the weekends, they firstly had a chance to learn about the issues. So they heard from 47 speakers in total with a wide range of different views about how to get to net zero, and they got to question them in depth. Then they discussed what they'd heard with one another, also really importantly bringing in their own life experiences, their own values, their own needs, their own preferences. And then they made their recommendations by voting by secret ballot. Taken together, the recommendations set out a clear and an internally consistent path to net zero. So the report contains over 50 specific policy recommendations, as well as recommendations about the overall direction of policy in each area that the Assembly looked at. So for how we travel, what we eat, how we generate our electricity, and so on. And running across all of those areas are a number of key themes, if you like messages in a stick of rock. So for example, it was really important to the Assembly that the path to net zero is fair for different regions, fair for people on different incomes, fair for people working in different sectors, fair for people with different preferences. They were also really keen that the path to net zero takes advantage of potential co-benefits. So for example, for local high streets, for people's health, for the economy, and so on. And the idea of freedom and choice was important to them as well. So this is about, where possible, letting local areas and individuals pick the solutions that are best for them, backed up by much better information and education to inform those choices. The other theme that ran right throughout their discussions and just came up again and again and again was this idea of strong leadership from government and also of a cross-party approach to change. So Assembly members really felt that they wanted certainty about what was going to happen and wanted there to be a phased and a planned transition. So they didn't want policy changing with every government, they wanted time to adjust. As you may have seen, we published recommendations in 2 different formats. So the first is an executive summary, which as you expect contains the key recommendations from across all the themes, plus an opening statement from Assembly members, which covers some of those overarching themes that ran through everything that I've just been through and is well worth a look. And then the full report has a detailed chapter on each of the themes that the Assembly covered, setting out both the Assembly's recommendations in full and their rationale for them as well. And that rationale is really important context for what they said. The full report is long. I hate to break it to you, it's about 566 pages, but you can read the bit that's of most interest to you. But it is in fact that range and that breadth and that depth of the recommendations and the rationale for them that makes this so valuable for policymakers. These are the chapters of the final report. So they start with a chapter that says a bit more about the process and about the Assembly's members. Then it goes on to look at the Assembly's first decision about underpinning principles for the path to net zero. And they made that decision at their first weekend, having heard a bit about climate change and the science, and also evidence about some of the overarching ethical and strategic questions about how to get to net zero. Then chapters 3 to 9 show you the main areas which the Assembly focused and their main recommendations. Then chapters 10 and 11 look at 2 areas that the Assembly covered at its final weekend. So at its final weekend, Assembly members asked for a chance to look at the impact of COVID-19 and the change context that creates for the path to net zero. And actually, Parliament had asked them to look at that too. So that was quite helpful that they both did from our point of view. And then also the Assembly members made their additional recommendations. So they looked back at everything they'd recommended up to that point and decided if there was anything else they wanted to recommend before the Assembly closed. So I think what we're going to do is run through quite a few of those areas in a high level way for you. And I think I'm going to go to Lorraine.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I obviously, as Sarah says, there's a huge amount of detail in the report. So we decided that we can't really do that justice, and what we would do is give you a flavour of the sorts of important things that came out of the report, but encourage you to look at the detail in there and to ask us any questions, allow lots of time for questions today. I just wanted to give an overview of the underlying principles, though, first, for the path to net zero. So the first thing that Assembly members were asked to do was to agree on the principles that should underpin the UK's path to net zero. So this is before they got into the detail of the separate topic areas. And this was emerged at their tables through discussion. So it was a bottom-up production of these principles, and then they voted on the main ones and ranked those. So they came up with 25 in total. You can see the top 10 here, and these principles form. They're not just about the recommendations to government and Parliament, but they also informed their discussions going forward. So they kind of run through, as you'll see, the sorts of things that they recommended in the different areas. So the first one was informing and educating everyone. They thought that was a really important prerequisite to getting to net zero, that the public, industry, government should be better informed about reaching net zero, and they felt that they were in a privileged position to have been given so much expert information and time to deliberate over the details of getting to net zero. So that was a really important principle. The second one was around fairness within the UK. So this was that they defined fairness themselves, and it captured a number of dimensions, but it included thinking about the most vulnerable. So in terms of affordability, so income, jobs, and thinking about a just transition in terms of different sectors, UK regions, and ensuring some aren't left behind, and so on. The third principle was around leadership, and Sarah's already mentioned it, that there was a very strong view that government should be leading, and that should involve clear, proactive, accountable and consistent action, and that should include a cross-party consensus as well. The fourth one was around protecting and restoring the natural world, and so giving consideration to biodiversity benefits in the sorts of actions that need to be taken to reach net zero. The fifth one was around ensuring solutions are future-proofed and sustainable for the future, so that we don't take actions now which might cause problems further down the line, that we're actually thinking about the longer term and being sustainable in the longer term. Linked to that, a joined up approach, so thinking about across society and across all levels of society. So this is not just about government being joined up, but actually about everybody acting in a consistent way and feeling part of a collective movement towards reaching net zero. Also, there was number 7 was around long-term planning and a phased transition. So actually thinking about that some things might take longer than other things, but we need to be kind of looking ahead and planning for the long term. But equally, number 8 is around urgency. So actually not putting off actions and actually taking action, as much action as we can now to address the urgent situation. The 9th was around support for sustainable growth, including pioneering innovation, so thinking about sort of economic co-benefits. And then the 10th one was around local community engagement and embedding local engagement and solutions within national solutions. Then moving on, as I say, we can't really, there isn't really time to go into all of the topic areas that we covered in a lot of detail. So what we're doing is just giving you a very high level flavour of the sorts of things that came out of the different subject areas and the details in the report. So on surface travel, one of the sort of things that came out there was around support for a future that minimises restrictions on how much travel we do. So there was support for reducing, for thinking about growth and tackling car use, but much more support for thinking about support for innovation, so electric vehicles, low carbon vehicles, and modal shift in terms of improving public transport to make it cheaper, more reliable and accessible. Similarly, in terms of air travel, there was this balance about protecting the right for people to fly and travel opportunities, with the need to think about actually restricting that and what that means in terms of carbon emissions. So there was strong support for taxes on air travel that would increase as people fly more or further, so something like a frequent flyer levy, but equally support for investment in new, cleaner aviation technologies as well. In the home, so energy use in the home, there was support for tailored solutions, tailored in terms of what different households need, what different local areas need, and providing a greater choice for householders. And again, support for innovation and technologies in terms of hydrogen, heat pumps, heat networks, and so on. In terms of what we eat and how we use the land, here there was strong support for more local produce and local food production. There was support for voluntary change in diets to reduce meat and dairy consumption by between 20 and 40%, and a managed diversity of land use. In other words, using the land to store carbon, as well as to produce food, but also thinking about other things that land can do, so protecting biodiversity, flood alleviation, etc. And support for farmers was a really strong theme that consistently came out of that topic. So thinking about how we can support farmers through the transition. The next topic was around what we buy, and some high-level things that came out of that was support for businesses to make less energy and material intensive products, so sort of thinking about the innovation side again, but also in terms of consumer change, there was support for individuals doing more to share products, to repair things, and so not needing to actually buy things so often. And equally, in order to support that, more information and to promote more informed choice, so better product labelling, for example, better information provision around what can be recycled, etc. In terms of energy supply, where our electricity comes from, there was strong support for renewables, so particularly wind power, both offshore and onshore, and solar power, whereas there was less support for nuclear, bioenergy and fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. And finally, the final topic was around greenhouse gas removals. And here that the stronger support came for forestation, better forest management, restoring and managing peatlands and wetlands, and also using more wood in construction, whereas there was less support for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture for carbon storage as well. And I think now I hand over to Becky for some reflections.
Thank you. Great, thanks Sarah, and thanks Lorraine. And given the group that we have assembled this afternoon, I just wanted to kick off the discussion by looking at what the implications of these findings are for NGOs and for the environmental sector. So, you know, these are very much my thoughts on almost sort of how to interpret the Assembly's findings, given that, you know, looking through the list of names of people on this call, there are people who've got, you know, vast experience of the environment sector and also the opportunity to use these results. So I would, in terms of interpreting the findings, I think it's really important not to sort of cherry pick and look at specific recommendations, but instead, as Sarah and Lorraine set out, look at what climate strategy overall the Assembly members are recommending, and that big picture about the levels of ambition necessary, about the need for leadership and cross-party support, and about the level of the challenge, I think are really important. And one place that comes up really clearly, for example, is around what they phrase as educating and informing. And that came across very strongly, that they felt privileged to have had this opportunity to be part of the Assembly, and they wanted other people to have access to the same information and do the same kind of deliberation that they'd done. So that runs throughout the report, and that big picture is to me as important as the individual recommendations. And one of the reasons that I think that's just as important is that, for me, one thing that really struck me both during the discussions and in this report is the conditionality. So, it wasn't, is technology X a good thing or not? It was, under what conditions would we support this approach or would we reject this approach? So a lot of those conditions depended on the themes of fairness, whether there was choice, whether solutions were embedded in particular local areas or communities. And so when you look at that conditionality, you get a much better idea of how to frame policies and how to approach different strategies or even different technologies. So, for example, if you looked at their objections around some of the carbon capture, it was because they were worried that carbon capture would basically delay other decisions because it would allow fossil fuel use to continue. So that conditionality is really important. And also, when you're digging through the report, have a look at what wasn't as popular. So, for example, in my group that looked at in the home, they were very keen on tailored local approaches, and actually had some concerns about smart homes because of worries about sort of corporate control and data safety. So again, what they didn't find, what they didn't support is as interesting as what they did support. And another thing I think really to stress is the uniqueness of this report in terms of distinguishing it either from opinion polling, which of course doesn't have the information or deliberation element to it. It's just asking people cold what they think of something. And this is very different because this actually asks citizens to work with Parliament and work with the experts to sort of co-create a climate strategy. So it's a very, very different proposition that you're putting to people. And that's why in some cases you get different answers than you might do from opinion polling. So, if there's very, very high levels of support for, for example, a particular tax, that doesn't mean that, an opinion poll would come up with the same answer. What it means is that, in the context of the route to net zero that we've set out here, if you meet these conditions, then we think this could be a viable policy. And that's a very, very different thing, I think, from opinion polling. But it's also, and really critically, I think, very different to expert recommendations. For example, compared to the Committee on Climate Change, actually a lot of the things a lot of their road to net zero is not that different from the Committee on Climate Changes. But the fact is that it was developed in a very different way. It's not a model or a kind of technical optimization. It is these people thinking through how different options fit their lives and fit the evidence they've heard, and it's based on their own lived experience. So a very, very different way, if you like, of developing a strategy for net zero. And for that reason, and I'll end with this thought, to my mind, there's been a bit of a debate in the press and on social media and so on about whether it's sort of radical or incremental, whether it's too radical as some of the press are saying, whether it's not radical enough as some of the activists are saying, and this links into the question of the 2050 date that was used to frame the Assembly. But I think that's missing the point, actually. What we get really strongly from citizens in this report is, okay, if you want us to play our part, this is what we're happy to do, this is what we want to contribute to, and this is what we expect out of government, this is what we expect out of businesses. And so it's actually much more about what that relationship between people and government and businesses looks like. It might not have quite the flavour that you would put on it. It might not be, it certainly won't, be as radical as some people would want it to be. But as an expression of the kind of partnership between those different groups that could get us to net zero, I think it's really strong. Hopefully you'll find ways to use that evidence to bolster the work that you're doing. And I know certainly it's it's really made me think a lot about how we both develop and present our views on climate strategy. So I'll leave it there, and I think I'm back to Chris. Is that right?
Yes, thank you, Becky and Lorraine and Sarah. Just before we come to the Q&A, and thank you for starting to submit questions there. I think Gwen from Green Alliance would just like to say a few words beforehand. So Gwen, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Gwen Buck, I'm a policy advisor at Green Alliance. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the experts for coming along today, because I know those of us working in the environment sector and those of us working in this scene really know how important Climate Assembly UK is, and I've been really excited about the results. So just a little bit of background about Green Alliance and our work on this. So for the past 3 years, Green Alliance has been championing the use of deliberative democracy in policy making. And it was actually sparked by a recommendation from, of course, Professor Rebecca Willis in her report, Building the Political Mandate for Climate Action, which Green Alliance published alongside Lancaster University back in 2018. So for the report, Becky anonymously interviewed MPs from across the political spectrum. And one thing was clear, that despite the cross-party support for strong carbon targets, MPs just weren't sure that they had the mandate from their constituents to act. So last year, Green Alliance and Britain Thinks ran 2 pilot citizens' juries on climate change to test the mandate for climate action. Our results showed that there was a clear mandate to act, and our results also mirrored that of Climate Assembly UK, that leadership from the government is a key priority for our participants. But our juries were, of course, just tiny compared to the mammoth scale of the UK's first National Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change, Climate Assembly UK. And of course, it was commissioned by 6 select committees. So it was a real cross-party initiative to truly get to grips with the public's mandate for those stickier climate policies. So yeah, once again, thanks so much to the panelists for coming in today, because I think it really is the start of something much bigger, and this use of deliberative democracy in policy making going forward. So thank you everyone for logging in, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A next.
Great. Thank you, Gwen. So just to take some questions first, a couple of factual points to start off with, which hopefully I can clear up before we get into the questions to experts. I think Adrian asked which were the committees that set it up. Quickly to go through those, it was Transport, Treasury, Environmental Audit Committee, Science and Technology, BEIS, and HCLG. And also just to clarify, in response to a question from, I think, Justin and Ava, the question that those committees asked the Assembly to answer was, how do we get to net zero by 2050? So that was what Parliament has legislated for, and so that was the essay question that was set. It wasn't a secondary and perhaps subsequent question about transforming the economy, media, political system more generally. So that's why they focused on net zero quite specifically. Okay, let me take a couple of questions from Ruth, actually, probably for Sarah. One question Ruth asked was, did any of the participants remain unconvinced that climate action was necessary, or did they leave the Assembly for this reason? And the second one is about the speakers and the selection of speakers. Ruth says the recommendations were laudable, but followed quite closely the recommendations that many environmental NGOs would make. Were the individuals in the Assembly exposed to carefully selected speakers and exposed to information that influenced the outcome? Sarah, can I ask you to tackle those two, perhaps?
So no, nobody left the Assembly because they were a climate skeptic. I mean, there were climate skeptics amongst Assembly members, but nobody dropped out. I think the attitude of the people who were less convinced that climate change is man-made was that they might not agree that climate change is real, but the UK is going to have to get to the net zero target, and how the UK does that is going to affect them as well as everybody else. And so they wanted to say and how the UK does that, and they participated very much in that light. We do have independent evaluators tracking the Assembly, and they have been monitoring whether people's views about climate change and about different areas changed, and they're publishing early next year. So I don't know if people's views change on climate change overall, but I know that the people who started off sceptical stayed with the Assembly throughout, and that's what they said on the early weekends about kind of why they were prepared to get involved. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything on that before I answer the next question. Okay, so in terms of who the speakers were, Assembly members heard from a really wide range of speakers, so including businesses, farmers, Rolls-Royce, the NFU, as well as some environmental NGOs, a lot of academics, like a wide range. You can find a full list of them on the Climate Assembly UK website, as well as all the presentations they gave to the Assembly, their slides and the transcripts of what they said as well. The process for deciding the speakers was purposely had multiple steps. So it started off with the expert leads, so Becky Lorraine, Chris Stark and Jim Watson, looking at who they would recommend. That went to an advisory panel with a very wide range of stakeholders on it, who thoroughly interrogated that, and also they could go back and sort of look at what a panel should and shouldn't be covering, as well as changing who they thought should be speaking to particular slots, and they did, and they commented on that as well. And then finally, those recommendations went to Parliament and were looked at by officials there who obviously have a lot of practice in putting together balanced information for MPs and select committees and so on. So it was a really thorough process to make sure that the Assembly was hearing balanced, accurate and comprehensive information. The only other point to say on that is that we had two types of speakers at the Assembly, and you'll find that labelled on the website as well. So we had informants who were asked to give the sort of balance of evidence in the area they were speaking on, and also advocates who were asked to give their or their organisation's opinion. And obviously where you had advocates, you had more than one advocate with different views. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Sarah. And please do like any of the questions in the panel, and so we'll take the most popular ones first. Question from Simon Roberts is asking, how much encouragement to push on do you think local leaders should take from this evidence that a representative but informed group of citizens can come up with wise choices and offer consent for urgent and relatively radical action? Does Becky, do you want to have a crack at that?
Yeah, sure, I'll have a go at that. Hi Simon. I mean, I think there's lots in there, definitely lots of encouragement, as you put it, in there, and not just for climate action, but also for locally tailored approaches, and that comes through particularly under home energy and food and farming and some aspects of transport. That's a strong theme. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely, if I was a local authority leader, I would definitely take succour from that. I would say I mean, you're going to predict what I'll say here, but the difficulty is, I think that citizens were asking lots more of local areas than they can probably deliver currently, given powers and budgets. So I think there's something for central government here, and certainly something that we're discussing with the parliamentary committees in terms of what whether local areas should have greater responsibilities, powers and budgets in this area. But I would say that the kind of the kind of levels of sort of consent or support are probably higher than local leaders thought. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Did you come in?
Just to add to that as well, I'm not sure exactly how the question was intended, but I wouldn't see this National Assembly as replacing the need for local engagement. And in fact, the Assembly members themselves talked about the importance of local engagement, because local residents will have a lot of relevant lived experience to the local area and be able to add a lot of insight about which solutions they think are the ones that are best tailored and most appropriate for the local area. So I do think local engagement is important as well.
Thank you. And do, when you're submitting questions, do add your organisation if you have one. That's helpful. Thank you. Question from Kate Hewitt from AEF. Do you have any thoughts on how the recommendation for more information education for the public should be best delivered? And is there any follow-up work on this? I can say a word about follow-up in a moment, but Lorraine, do you want to kick off on that one?
Yeah, I'll start. So, I mean, I think it's interesting. I led on the topics of food, farming and land use and what we buy. And in there, as in the other topics, you know, information education was a really, really important principle that they prioritised. It was really their top policy choice. So to give you some examples, we were quite concrete actually in the sorts of things we were talking about within the topic. So it could include, say, food and drink labelling to show the kind of carbon emissions associated with different food and drink choices. Similarly, for other sorts of products, labelling to inform of the carbon impacts of those choices, but also more broadly thinking about kind of information and education, formal education within schools, through to sort of skills training of different groups. So again, within the food topic, it was about thinking about what skills might farmers need to transition to more kind of low carbon farming and net zero in general. But equally in other sectors, raising children to kind of think about sort of healthy food choices and maybe having skills to be able to prepare meals and plan meals. But it also links to this broader idea of engagement. So there was really strong support for continuing to involve the public in a more deliberative way, as has been mentioned. So it spanned not only kind of one-way flow of information, but also this more kind of dialogic kind of approach as well. So yeah, the report I think captures lots of really specific, nice examples of the sorts of policies they had in mind there.
Thanks, Lorraine. And just on your point about follow-up, so last Thursday, the Bayes Select Committee announced an inquiry into the findings of the Climate Assembly, and they're going to announce what that's going to include. So that's the education point, but also much wider as well. So I think there'll be more announcements to come on that. So moving on to, oh, sorry, Sarah.
It's very brief. It's just to say, if you're interested in looking more around the education information point, in the chapter on additional recommendations, the Assembly members voted on a few specific ideas around that got quite a lot of support. And also in the COVID-19 chapter, a lot of Assembly members were very struck by the level of public information that had been available to people during the COVID crisis, and were of the view that if you know, climate change is an emergency, then why couldn't some of the ways that had been used to transmit information during the COVID crisis be used around climate change as well?
Thank you. Question from Greg Archer. Has there been any attempt to quantify the impact of the recommendations, and were participants made aware that their proposals may not deliver net zero by 2050? If I could just answer that, the first part of that question, in terms of the impact, there is an evaluation that is going on, independent evaluation by academics on the process and also the impact of the Climate Assembly, and that is expected to be published next spring. In terms of what Assembly members were made aware of, Sarah, I think that's probably one for you. That's were Assembly members, were participants made aware that their proposals may not deliver net zero by 2050? Or perhaps it's not for you, Sarah.
I think it's actually for Becky, but I would happily answer it, but Becky's got her hand up, so I'll let her.
I can take it. You can chip in, Sarah. I mean, I think if I read Greg's question correctly, it's do the recommendations add up to net zero? So generally speaking, because the brief was how do we deliver net zero by 2050, across the various subject themes, we presented the participants with different scenarios which would meet the 2050 goals. So all the time we were looking at scenarios that would meet that goal, and participants were choosing between different options. The only two areas where we didn't expect to eliminate all emissions by 2050 were, as you probably guessed, aviation and some of the farming and land use recommendations. In that case, we spoke to participants about options for carbon removal as well. So very broadly, we haven't done a an actual detailed analysis, because that would be a huge job, but very broadly they were voting on scenarios which would lead to 2050 net zero, including removals in some areas. I mean, I think, Chris, if it's all right with you, I could tie that into the next question about the 2050 target. because I think there's a link here. So we did keep that focus on 2050 quite tight because that was the one given to us by Parliament. So the Assembly members didn't hear evidence on, you know, a 2030 date or a 2070 date for that matter. We stuck with the 2030 date. Some of the Assembly members wanted to have that discussion about whether the target should be brought forward, and that was something that they looked at when they had a chance to offer their additional recommendations back. So that whether there were two similar votes on whether we should achieve net zero by 2030. Those weren't carried by a majority of Assembly members, but that might be because they didn't actually hear evidence on that point. As we said, evidence was to 2050. So when you look at the results of those, and that's in the additional recommendations section, you'll see that a third wanted the target brought forward, a third didn't want it brought forward, and a third were unsure. So there was quite a big bunch of unsure, as you would imagine, because they haven't had evidence on that topic.
Thanks, Becky. A question from Ruth on trade policy. Trade policy is a big issue and will impact on many of the things mentioned in the report. She says it doesn't look like this came up in the deliberations. Is that right? And are there plans to follow up on any issues? Lorraine, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I can start because I think it probably came out quite strongly in some of the topics we looked at, which was the food, farming and land use and what we buy. So there was evidence presented around how much of what we consume, including food, is imported, also how much is exported, etc. So there was information provided around that. What we would, you know, again, in terms of the overall framing for the Assembly, we were told to focus on UK territorial emissions, but we did leave open the possibility that if Assembly members wanted to think about the kind of global context and kind of how emissions overseas, you know, how policies would affect emissions overseas, that discussions could capture that. So, and that did come out, and you can sort of see that in some of the recommendations, that there was a real interest in thinking about the global context. And for example, again, in the food topic, there was support for more UK production of food and so fewer imports, but there was an opportunity to think about trade in that context. I don't know if, yeah, Sarah probably wants to add.
Just to add a couple of things, which is that I think in the underpinning principles and the additional recommendations, there are a few recommendations that have implications for trade policy, even if they're not framed as about trade policy. So, for example, the additional recommendation that got the third highest number of votes, so 92% support from Assembly members, was about getting to net zero without pushing our emissions to elsewhere in the world, which obviously does have implications for imports and exports and so on.
Thank you. There's quite a lot of questions coming in now, so we'll try and whiz through a few. Daniel Rubio asks, what's the future of the Assembly? Does this provide a model for future citizen involvement in developing policy? What's next? So just from my perspective, the Assembly delivered what it was asked to deliver, so I think formal involvement sort of ceases at that point. I would just mention the Secretary of State for Business in his address at the launch last Thursday did make some encouraging noises about public engagement in policy making, and you know, we're hoping to have conversations with the department on that in the weeks ahead. So does anyone, Becky, do you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I mean, as many of you will know, quite a few local areas are doing citizens' juries or citizens' assemblies. Some have completed, and there are a lot in progress. So it's really encouraging to see that. Scotland's starting their own as well. I think one thing I would say, having looked at this quite closely in research, is that I mean, it's really important to do these big, you know, set piece events like the Climate Assembly, but I think, you know, from my own point of view, what's needed is just much more sort of day-to-day deliberation and engagement as part of the policy process. I was really struck by one MP in the launch, one of the chairs of the select committee, saying it's actually really rare to get this kind of input into the political system and the policy making system from individuals who've had a real chance to be informed and think things through, and then add their lived experience into the pot. And it strikes me, having worked on policy for a long time, that is a real missing ingredient. So I think one direction that my work is taking is to look much more at how you can build deliberation into the policy making process as a matter of course, the same way that you might talk to other stakeholders.
Sarah, do you want to add something on that?
This is obviously very much involves area, and I would second what Becky said. So you don't always need a citizens' assembly, so involve advocates kind of using appropriate methods of public engagement given that the question you want to ask and the context. And I do think there's a place for embedding deliberation properly within policy making across a whole range of areas, including where appropriate and only where appropriate, using citizens' assemblies, which are usually used on issues that are particularly moral, complex, constitutional or controversial. But you really, for those kind of big ticket issues, rather than smaller scale stuff that can be ongoing more of the time.
Thank you, and hopefully that answers some of the questions from Stephen and Andy as well on the future of climate assemblies. One specific one from Harriet Williams on the budget of the Climate Assembly, and whether it's a figure that is within reach of the average local authority that has signalled an intention to do this type of exercise. Is cost a barrier? Sarah?
So I don't think a local authority needs to do a citizens' assembly on the scale of this one. I think citizens' juries are a really good method for local authorities, and also depending on exactly who they want, what they want out of it, what they're asking, who they want to engage, there are a range of other methods that they might want to consider as well. So I don't think you should be looking to engage kind of people. Obviously, you immediately get rid of the cost of people travelling from across all the UK wide, if you see what I mean. So there's some costs you don't have immediately, but I would say something smaller scale is appropriate for a local area, and perhaps something with more of an outreach phase first to reach a wider range of people, and then bring together with a smaller group would be a lot cheaper. And I don't think it's local authority should be spending that amount of budget.
Thank you. Sue James, sorry if I missed you earlier. You've got two questions. So firstly, did the Assembly feel confident about getting strong government engagement sorry, the question has just jumped, but just try and find it again. Here we are. Did the Assembly feel confident about getting strong government leadership? And secondly, you mentioned the Teach the Future Climate Crisis Youth-led campaign, which is having trouble getting support from government for climate and ecological emergency to be embedded throughout education. If education is the key, is this not a critical starting point? So there's two questions there. The first one on, did the Assembly feel confident about getting strong government leadership? It was certainly one of their key demands that the government should lead and that there should be cross-party support. I don't know whether we can say more about did they feel confident. I don't think that was one of the questions that we specifically asked them. So we probably don't have an accurate measure there. Becky, did you want to add something on either one of them?
No, I just wanted to say anecdotally, being at those weekends, it was the number one thing that that Assembly members raised and were very exercised about. How would the results be used, and how would government take this forward? So that there will be 108 people watching very closely to see what happens next.
Thank you. Question here from Colin Church. Was much connection made between consumption, consumerism and tackling climate change? And if so, what was the mood of the Assembly on consumption and consumerism? Does anyone want to, Lorraine, have an assessment of the mood of the Assembly?
Yeah, I'll start. So I mean, so within the what we buy topic, obviously that we had to present a lot of information, but one of the things that we did touch on was some of the evidence around kind of the links between consumption and well-being, or rather the inverse relationship, and that beyond a certain level, happiness doesn't of consumption, happiness doesn't necessarily increase. So we did touch a little bit on that, and we discussed some of amongst the various policy options that we talked about. Some of it was around advertising, and we discussed kind of bans or restrictions on advertising per se, or at least for certain types of maybe high emission products. So it came out, I think, through quite a number of those sorts of discussions that we had within the What We Buy topic. So what was the mood of the Assembly? I mean, I think there was a recognition that we need to be tackling demand, that actually there is one of the things that they were strongly supportive of was a shift towards a more sharing economy, that kind of supporting people to maybe buy fewer things but hold on to them for longer and share, and rather than owning so much stuff. So broadly speaking, I think there was kind of support for some shift away from consumerism, but equally, there was some nuance. So I mean, I think some people also recognize some of the benefits, the economic benefits, and some of the kind of tensions around economic growth tied up with that. So it wasn't a sort of, I think there was a lot of recognition of the complexity of the issue.
Thank you. Coming out a question from Duncan McLaren. Would it be true to say that citizens tended to favour technical innovation over behavioural change? Do you have any insights as to why or why not? Becky, over to you.
I think Sarah wants to come in on this as well, but let me just kick off. I think it was really variable, actually, Duncan. So in aviation, there was a lot of discussion, both discussion of and recommendations of technological investment in different technologies, and looking for a technological route. I would say in the group I looked at, energy use in the home, there was actually quite a lot of suspicion almost of some of the more sort of techie options, the smart home ICT type stuff, and more favour of good old fashioned local authorities doing stuff. And linked to that, I think there's a link with Dave Tim's question below. Are there areas where there was technical complexity or uncertainty and participants couldn't make a confident choice? I think that if you look at the answers around carbon storage, there was certainly a lot of interest in and loads of questions about carbon storage. So I actually think with that, the reasons for being hesitant about it were partly that it was new to them, but actually just as much questions of how they felt that technology would be used, and particularly whether they felt it would be used as a sort of get out clause to do less carbon reduction in the first place, certainly in terms of electricity generation. That came out strongly. So the views on technology overall, to pick up those two questions, are I think really nuanced and very much dependent on that sort of conditionality that we talked about. Sarah.
Chris, I assume you said I could speak. So I would agree with Becky that the view on technology versus behaviour change really varied throughout the chapters. I would just add actually on Dave Tims's question that I would perhaps have gone slightly less for carbon capture and storage, but definitely for bioenergy and BECCS. I think people had appreciated that bioenergy could be generated in lots and lots of different ways, and I think a lot of people felt that their support for bioenergy and BECCS would really depend on, or particularly bioenergy would really depend on how it's done. So I think there's more detail that could be looked into there around what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, although the rationale that Assembly members gave for their views on bioenergy does start to pick out, well, if it was done like this, that would be better than if it was done like that.
Thank you. Not long left, but I'm really keen to get answers to a couple of questions on fairness and how the Assembly defined fairness. What was the discussion like on fairness? That's really interesting. Sarah, do you want to have a go at that? Those two questions, I think, Ava and Justin, and also another one from Neil Stockley. just about how fairness was defined and discussed.
So Assembly members defined fairness themselves, and they defined it very broadly. I'd say in a general sense, it probably aligns with what people understand by just transition, although Assembly members wouldn't have, most of them wouldn't know that phrase in order to use it, if you see what I mean. But they talked a lot about different regions, about different income groups, about people with disabilities, for example, in the transport section, about farmers with different with lands in different geographical areas that might be suitable or not suitable for different things. So it was really about making sure that no one group was disadvantaged by the path to net zero or left behind by it, would be like the general sense of it, and they really reached that themselves.
And the question, the other fairness question was whether it was, I've lost it, but it was about whether people thought about fairness globally. They did, some did, and that was one of the one of the principles put forward. Actually, the principle around fairness within the UK got quite a lot more support than fairness globally. But I think that there was a, there were Assembly members who wanted global fairness as an overriding principle, and also if you look particularly in the additional recommendations, that comes out in terms of, for example, making sure that we don't just push our emissions elsewhere. So that did come up, but the most popular sort of fairness recommendation was UK based.
Yeah, and there are also other points throughout. So, for example, people were looking at how things were manufactured, and there are comments throughout, conditions around things. So, like when you're manufacturing something, that's fine, but condition on that, please, can we make sure that the manufacturing methods aren't causing problems overseas for people or the environment? So there's little nuggets like that throughout the report as well.
Thank you. There's one or two questions on how will this land with the government. I don't think we can answer those, I'm afraid. We might have opinions, but probably best to focus on things we can answer about the Assembly. And one of those questions from Sue Riddleston, Bio-Regional. What did the Climate Assembly think about home energy retrofit? So I think that was in Becky's area.
That was in my group, yeah. So I mean, they wanted it to happen. There was strong pushback to the idea that homeowners should be sort of left to their own devices, even with support, actually. You know, even with financial support, for example. They wanted tailored local solutions to home energy retrofit. They were supportive of a sort of deep retrofit approach, as in, you know, doing one house all in one go, but only if there was a really clear system in place for financial support and for other support in terms of information provision. So I think they wanted to see it happen, but they said it was a big deal, and it was a lot to do with the disruption in the home and the costs involved.
Thank you. Well, I'm conscious that we've just about run out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you all for your interest and engagement and questions, and you know, do contribute to and follow the debate which is going to ensue from this point. Sorry we can't take all of your questions, but great to see so much engagement. Does Gwen, do you want to say anything before signing off? Thank you very much for hosting this and helping to put it together, Gwen.
Yes, I'd just like to say once again, thank you so much to all the panelists involved. It's been amazing to see Climate Assembly UK sort of grow from this tiny idea into this huge scale, amazing piece of work. There's so much detail online, so I'd encourage everyone to follow Climate Assembly UK on Twitter, have a look at the website. And I know our speakers here are on Twitter as well and very active. So thanks once again to everyone in the sector for coming along to this briefing session. And to those of you at Post as well who've been so, you know, working so hard behind the scenes. I know it's been an amazing task, but everyone's achieved something pretty amazing. So yeah, thanks once again to everyone for joining this webinar, and we'll look forward to working with you again soon.